a fire drill in one of the buildings, and the speaker and the rabbi are hung up in the traffic coming into the building. So we're all going to wait a couple seconds, have patience, and as soon as they arrive, I'm sure it'll be a very informative, meaningful, and wonderful program. So we thank you very much for being here. We thank you for your patience, and we hope that they'll be here momentarily.
Good morning. My name is David Walzak, and on behalf of the CMS Holocaust Memorial Program Committee, I would like to welcome everyone here and in our regional and DC offices to this year's Holocaust Memorial Program. The title of this year's program is Escape from the Holocaust. Each year, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services observes the remembrance of the Holocaust by memorializing those who died and honoring those who survived. Despite all the historical evidence, there are still people who deny that the Holocaust actually happened. And based on what is going on in the world today with so much hate, it could possibly happen again to any group of people. Therefore, it is important for us to hear the testimony of those who survived and witnessed the horrors of the Holocaust. From Holocaust survivors, liberators, and witnesses, we learn the truth, not fabrications or fake news about what really happened. So as the number of Holocaust survivors diminishes, it is also important to hear their stories, their firsthand stories of survival, because soon we will have to hear their stories through their children, their children's children, or through other relatives. We are very fortunate to have a Holocaust survivor with us today, our guest speaker, Mrs. Martha Weiman. Martha will later talk about her life as a young girl in Germany who witnessed Kristallnacht in November 1938, and her father being arrested and sent to Buchenwald. She will talk about how her family escaped Germany and the importance of remembering the terrible events of the Holocaust. And now I would like to welcome back Rabbi Tsvi Schur, who will give us his personal thoughts on remembering the Holocaust. Thank you.
Sorry we were delayed, but I got to know the speaker. I like this memorial candle, which is done always at a time of a anniversary of death. My dear friends, I stand before you today as an agent of our Creator, trying to represent Him well. But I am pained, as I'm sure is the Almighty Himself, about what His children, His creations, are doing to this beautiful world that He has entrusted to us. We are here to remember and never forget the cruelty that was perpetuated against men, women, and children during the 30s and early 40s by the accursed Nazis regime. We have heard it said, if you forget history, you will be bound to repeat it. And so tragically, we have not learned from the lessons of the past. To this day, innocent human beings are being slaughtered, and I use the terminology slaughtered. We witness the existence of Holocaust deniers saying the Jews willingly went into the crematoriums, or that it never happened. It's a matter of history that when Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, found the victims of the death camps, he ordered all possible photographs to be taken, and for the German people from surrounding villages to be ushered through the camps and even made to bury the dead. He did this because he said it in the words to this effect, quote, "Get it all on record now, get the films, get the witnesses, because somewhere down the road of history, some bastard will get up and say that this never happened," unquote. Whoever hears my voice today, I plead with you, read history, seek out survivors. How much longer can we let chemical warfare kill babies and children? Yes, there is evil in the world, but Almighty, there is also so much good. Almighty, you as our Father and Mother, you as our Creator, please, we turn to you. No, we beg of you to help put a stop to this madness. Open the eyes of the haters. Destroy their evil plans. We can't do this without you. O merciful Almighty God, please show us how we can save your world before it's too late. We turn to you each in our own way, praying for your intervention and guidance. Please, let those of us who are civil wake up to see the fruition of your blessings, that war and hate will cease. May this be your will, and let us all say, Amen.
Thank you, Rabbi. Our guest speaker, Ms. Martha Weiman, was born in 1934 in Buchenwald, Germany. Martha and her family witnessed the arrests, beatings, destruction of Jewish-owned businesses and synagogues, book burnings, and other acts of violence and destruction perpetrated against Jews, as German authorities did nothing during what was called Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. Kristallnacht occurred on November 9th to 10th in 1938 throughout Germany. Even though Germany started World War II on September 1, 1939 by invading Poland, the actions taken towards Jews on those 2 days in November of 1938 are considered by historians to be the beginning steps of the Holocaust, because they were part of the Nazis' so-called final solution plan to systematically exterminate the Jews. Today we will hear Martha Weiman's story of how her family escaped the Holocaust in Germany and eventually made it to America in 1940. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Martha Weiman.
Good morning. I was born in Buchenwald, Germany, a small town on the Dutch border. We had a good life there. We had a lot of friends, Jewish and non-Jewish, and when the Nazis came to power, that all started to ebb away. We had a business that was started by my father and my grandfather, so we had deep roots there. The business was a curtain and drapery business. And at that time, when the Nazis started marching up and down the street in front of the business, they would smear tar on the windows, large Jewish stars, and the word Jude, which means Jew in German. So after a very short time, my father said, we cannot stay here anymore. We need to move possibly to a bigger city where there are more Jews and we can disappear. I think German Jews at that time it was hard to believe that this was something that was government sanctioned. That was something that happened in Eastern Europe, but not in Germany, where the Jews were very assimilated. So we decided to move to Frankfurt, lost our house in Buchenwald, the business, went to Frankfurt. My parents had to start over there. My brothers went to school, tell me the story of, I was not in school yet, how they were chased by kids throwing rocks at them on the way home from school, and there were many, many restrictions on Jews already at that time. We weren't there very long when we realized that we needed to leave and go somewhere else, anywhere, get out of Germany. Now, I had an uncle and an aunt who were young marrieds, decided they wanted to come to the United States. They had no children, so they left. Where did they go? To Baltimore. Hence, that's why I'm in Baltimore. I could have been anywhere, but since that was their home and it was our only connection to this country at that time. So Kristallnacht came. There were 2 nights of Kristallnacht, as David said, November 9th and 10th. The first night, they came to our house looking for Jewish men to arrest. There was someone that my parents knew, interestingly enough, not Jewish, who stood in front of the door of the house and swore to the Nazis there were no Jews living here. So they left. The next night, November 10th, they came back. We lived across the street from a large synagogue. They looted the synagogue. They took out the prayer books, the holy Torahs, and they set fire to them in the middle of the street. I remember seeing the fire, probably didn't know what it was, but my brothers did because they were quite a bit older than me. My oldest brother had already had his bar mitzvah, so they had great recollections of what went on. On that night, the Nazis did come into the house looking for what they called eligible men, and my father fit their bill, so they arrested him. And they took him away. My mother didn't know at first where he went. He wound up in Buchenwald, which you may have heard of, became a concentration camp. At that time, it wasn't what is formally known now as a concentration camp. They said it was for political prisoners. My father had absolutely no interest in politics. It was just an excuse. So my mother, who was a very tough, strong lady, started to try and find a way to get us visas to get out of the country, which incidentally we had already applied for, and we thought that they were ready for us. So actually, before my father was arrested, that very day, I have to backtrack a little bit, he decided to go to Stuttgart, where all the visas were being held, to find out where our papers were, which we had been assured the packet was ready for us to leave. But again, he met someone he knew in a Nazi uniform. It was the son of someone that had worked with my parents, and he said to my father, "Mr. Meyer, don't go to Stuttgart, go home, because they are killing Jews, Jewish men today, and you may disappear and your wife won't know where you are." So he did go home. So fast forward to that night when he was arrested out of the house. At first, my mother didn't know where he was. She then began to try and find a way to get out of the country. She met a British consular officer, and to this day, I don't know how she got to him. There were a lot of questions that both of my brothers had the answers to, but it's that old woulda, coulda, shoulda, questions I wish I had answered before both of them died. So I just have to tell you what I think happened. She found a British consular officer. He actually put together a visa for us to get us as far as England. We later found out that he had falsified those papers out of just having a lot of empathy and sympathy for the straits that the family was in. And then it was just waiting. My father was in Buchenwald 2 months. We didn't know if or when he was coming back. At that time, the Germans only wanted to get Jews out of Germany. They weren't systematically killing them, although many men did die at Buchenwald that my father told us about reluctantly later on. But he had been badly beaten up. He had been unconscious for several days. And one night, he appeared literally on our doorstep wearing the same clothes he had on 8 weeks earlier in terrible, terrible health. But he was back. So my mother nursed him to health as quickly as she could. We now had the affidavit to leave, and within weeks, we left. We were allowed to take with us 1 suitcase per person and 10 Deutsche Marks, which I have no idea what that translated into, but I can pretty much tell you it wasn't very much money. So we had packed up all of our belongings, all of our goods, and we had a freight company, you may know the name, Hapag-Lloyd. To this day, they're still in business. They came, they put everything that we had into a container shipment, ostensibly to be shipped to us. We never saw anything. So literally, when we escaped, we had those 5 suitcases and 10 Deutsche Marks per person. So we then took a train from Frankfurt. Train stopped in Cologne. My grandfather lived in Cologne. He was a very elegant, successful businessman. My brothers tell me that he was one of the few people that in those days owned a car and had a chauffeur. He got on the train with us, but because we had no papers for him, he had no papers, he went with us to the Dutch border. And then, of course, he had to get off. And I will tell you a little bit more about what happened to him a little later on. We went at that point to the Hook of Holland. At the Hook of Holland, we took a ferry. The ferry took us to Harwich in England. In Harwich, we took another train. We went to London, and as I am told, this is where my real memories begin. We were 5 people and 5 suitcases standing on a platform in a large train station in London. We had absolutely no place to go. There was a very active Jewish community in London at that time, and within a few days, we were in touch with them. But my brothers tell me we ate in soup kitchens the first 3 days. So they got us a place to live, if you can call that a place to live. We had a basement room. All 5 of us were in that basement room. We ate there. My mother cooked in a kitchen that was shared by 5 other families, and we shared a bathroom with 5 other families. And my father couldn't work. My brothers were taken out of school and were just kind of kicking around, had no place to go, nothing to do. Nobody spoke any English. So ultimately, we did get a bigger apartment. Again, the Jewish community managed to get us a larger place to live. Of course, my mother immediately rented out every small nook and cranny to any other refugees. There were a lot of young people also floating around in London who had no place to go, had no place to live, had no place to eat. So she would be baking, selling her baked goods, cooking for these people, and even had a couple of them live with us while we were there. Now, our thought was, when we got to London, that we were going to be in London a few days just for processing. We were there almost a year. So it was a very rough year. And London, England was at war already. There were a few bombs that dropped not too far away, but we just had to make it go. And finally, after that almost a year passed, we got a notice that we could go on a British freighter. I was a young married before I ever really thought about that, and looked up this freighter, which I found the name of, and there were 85 Jews on this ship. Now, a freighter is delivering goods, is not equipped for that many people, but that they did it, I'm still in awe of. I actually found many years later, probably just about 10 years ago, the entire manifest of that ship. It was called the Nova Scotia, which answered a lot of questions for me because I never understood why we landed in the port of Boston. That kind of answered the question. We took that northern circuitous route, which is where they were dropping off whatever it is they had on the ship. So the ship was a dismal, dismal trip. We were on that ship for 3 weeks. After 3 weeks, we got to Newfoundland. Something was wrong with the ship. There had to be repairs. And we were allowed off the ship. Lo and behold, what do we find? A Jewish community in Newfoundland. And they welcomed us. They had milk for the children. There was no milk on this ship. The food was absolutely terrible on this ship. It was not meant for families with children. So this Jewish community kicked in, welcomed us, but we lived on the ship. Then we went on. We had one more stop where they were offloading, and we finally wound up in Boston. Now, when we were in Boston, we were taken in by 2 families. We were split up. I was with my younger of my 2 brothers and my mother, and my father and my other brother went to someone else's house. These were people who were just, out of the goodness of their hearts, took us in for 3 days while they were doing all the processing that had to be done. And interestingly enough, I found out that both of these families were not Jewish. And this has always impressed me so much. I have no idea who they were, but out of the goodness of their hearts, they provided us a home for those 3 days. And I always remember my father, with all of his illnesses, which he never got over that. I know now he had PTSD, but that was not a term that was known in that time, but it lasted until he died. But he had a great sense of humor. And the first thing that they gave him to eat when he went to their house was a peanut butter sandwich. Now, peanut butter was totally foreign to us. It was unheard of. They didn't have peanut butter in Europe. That was strictly an American thing. And he always used to tell us, when I ate that sandwich, I really considered going back to Germany if that's what they eat here. So just a little levity and a not so funny story. So we stayed there for 3 days, and then it was traveling again. I can't tell you how many vehicles and moving things we were in during that whole year, and we took a Greyhound bus to Baltimore. Now, there was no Route 95, so you can imagine how long it takes to get from Boston. Now you can get there in 8 or 9 years, 8 or 9 hours in a car now, but then it seemed like it took forever. So when we got to Baltimore, we met my aunt and uncle, and there was a great reunion. And then, of course, life took over. My parents couldn't speak any English. Kids pick it up pretty quickly. People always think that when they hear me speak, I'm going to have an accent. Both of my brothers did. Very slight, but you knew they weren't born here. But it's kind of under the age of 12, I think, is the cutoff, 11 or 12, when you don't retain any accent. So I always tell people the only accent I have is a Baltimore accent. So then my father had to find work. So in Baltimore, there is the Associated Jewish Federation, and they were wonderful. They took over. They found us a place to live. Again, the first place we lived was in a tiny little apartment. It had 1 bedroom. The 3 kids slept in the bedroom. My parents in the living room, and one of these little tiny Pullman kitchens, which just had enough for a stove and a refrigerator. So we were there for a while, and then they found us another place to live, which was just a couple of blocks away from where we were, but it was a large house that was owned by a very wealthy Jewish family, and the woman who owned the house lived on the 3rd floor in a small apartment because she was a college professor and was rarely there. So we had these 2 floors in this house, and once again, my mother kicked in with the cooking and the baking and renting whatever room she could to somebody who needed a place to live. So we lived there for quite a while. All the while, my father, with little knowledge of English, it was still up in the air. What was he going to do? So the Associated got him a job. Now, my father was a lot older than my mother. He was 50 years old, and I can't even imagine what it must have been like for him. But they sent him to Mount Washington. Mount Washington, if those of you who know where it is in Baltimore, was the country. These big, beautiful homes, which are still there, was where people who lived in the city went there as their country home. It's not the country anymore. It's very much the city. But he went there, and they gave him a lawnmower, and he cut the grass. And he's 50 years old. And I always think about that when I see so many people in our neighborhood, and they're all Hispanic. And they come to our neighborhood, and they speak very little English, and there they are tending to the bushes and the flowers and the grass, and they work so hard, and they have such a work ethic, and the dignity of doing what they're doing because they can't do anything else always gets me and makes me think of my father, how he started. He later got a job in a factory in Baltimore, and he worked in the factory until his health just wouldn't allow it. A lot of that health was mental as well as physical. He then had lost some of his eyesight, which they determined probably came from the beatings he sustained when he was in the concentration camp. In the meantime, my mother, who was always very resourceful, got a used sewing machine and put it in the basement and tried to resurrect that drapery business that we had, which incidentally is still here, and my daughter runs it now for us. So she did resurrect that. She put an ad, and there's a publication in Baltimore, it's still here, called the Baltimore Jewish Times. She put a tiny ad in there that she would make draperies. I don't even know where that came from, but she did it. She would take a street card, take a pad of paper, a pencil, and a ruler. If anybody called her, go out and measure and come back and make draperies out of the basement of our house. My father, meanwhile, he finally had to get a lot more help. He was hospitalized once that I remember, and he never went back to work in the factory, so my mother sort of became the breadwinner, but he then ultimately really helped her. Now, in the meantime, we didn't know what happened to my grandfather. We got here in 1940. It was, I would say, 1943 before my mother found out from someone else who had gotten out that he had been arrested with a sister, which I didn't know until very recently because when the Nazis kept impeccable records, and I actually found all the information about when he was deported. He was picked up in Cologne. He was sent to Theresienstadt, which is Czechoslovakia, along with his older sister. I was at the museum, the Holocaust Museum, some years ago in Washington, and I went up to the library. I was there with a bunch of kids who had a leader, and I'd been there so many times, and I thought, oh, I'll dig around, see if I can find something about him. Sure enough, I found a book called The Jews of Cologne that the Nazis had put together, a hardback book, had the name of every Jew that was deported from Cologne, had their birth date, the date of their death, the number of the car they were in, the railroad car. I mean, it was very detailed, and it was very, very jarring to see that. So, in any case, he was deported to Theresienstadt, and he lasted. This sister of his was older, and I understand from what I could see, because they have the date of her death too on these in the papers that we found from the Germans. She lasted 2 or 3 weeks and died. He was there a few months before he died. We think that he died of malnutrition. A lot of people did. So that was the end of that, but it took me such a long time to reconcile the fact that she never knew who her father was. You know, when you're a kid, you don't think about that. But when I grew up, I thought, my God, what would that have been like for me if I didn't know where my father was? He just literally disappeared into thin air. There was other family that also disappeared. And when I say disappeared, I've tried to get information, but there just isn't any, and I have very little to go on. So back to what happened when we came here to the United States. We weren't here but several years. It was in the middle of World War II. And my brother was drafted into the U.S. Army. So, again, it took me a long time to think about what that might have been like for my mother. The other brother was drafted a little bit later. Now, Harry, whose real name was Hans, when he was drafted, he said, you know, I'm not going into the U.S. Army and we're at war with Germany with a name like Hans. So he changed his name to Harry Hans, or Harry H. So he was then drafted, put into the infantry. In their infinite wisdom, the Army put him in the infantry. Here's somebody who speaks, reads, and writes fluent German, and they put him, here's a gun, go kill Germans, which is what he did until he was wounded, but very slightly, but just enough that he had a little R&R time, and that's when the Army finally decided, you know, this is somebody we need to put in the CRC, which was their secret service kind of in the Army, where they would interrogate Germans. And some of his stories are amazing. He turned out to be quite the hero. He was awarded a Bronze Star for all the things that he did during World War II, but he tells a story that we always laugh about in the family, but it was really kind of ingenious. He and his partner would go to interrogate Nazis, and he said they were on a farm, and they brought these Nazis into a barn, but before they brought them in, they went out and they caught a chicken, and they killed the chicken. And then they went into the barn and swung that chicken around, and the whole place was splattered with blood. And then they brought the German in to interrogate them. And he always said, they answered all of our questions. And then he added, and we had chicken for dinner. So thank God our family retained a sense of humor, because there's nothing funny about the subject, but you know, if you don't have a sense of humor, you might as well curl up in a corner somewhere. So at that time, there was all the worry about money, about making a living. My father really couldn't work. My mother was trying to start this business out of the basement. And I was so much younger. My brothers were gone. It was a terrible time, and I know they loved me and they cared for me, but they really didn't have time for me. So I pretty much kicked around on my own. And by the time I got to it's now middle school, what was junior high school, I always felt like I was on the outside looking in. I would never want to relive those years. And I remember meeting the girls, and I always tell people, girls can be bitchy. And indeed they were. They would think I was so exotic and get me into a ladies' room, a girls' room, and tell us your story, tell us how you got here. And I would feel good. It was attention. And then I walked out the door and they went that way and I went that way. So that was kind of the growing up years. And then, of course, my mother got busier and busier in the basement. And I remember her telling me when I came home from school, and by the way, I kept my home life, I had two lives, my school life, my home life. I just kept it all very separate because nobody I knew had parents with heavy accents whose mother worked in the basement, whose father was sick. So I just kind of pushed that aside. I was very good at compartments in my brain, compartmentalizing everything. So I would go home, my mother would say, peel the potatoes. So I did. And one thing led to another, and pretty soon, I'm 15, 16 years old, and I came home and I was cooking dinner for the family or whoever was there because she really didn't have time, which of course, by the time I met my husband, and we met when I was 18, got married at 19, he loved it. He didn't know any girls that knew how to cook, and much less even bake. So that was a plus, and sometimes I wonder if that's why he married me. He says that's not true. But in any case, here I am, married 64 years, and trying not to cook anymore. That really deserves applause. It's a slog, but you make it work. You make it work. We have 3 kids and 4 grandchildren, and they're carrying the torch forward. I was talking about this in the car coming over here, that many of the second-generation children of survivors have been sheltered from what their parents went through, and they're not doing what they could be doing or being as involved. But I've found now, all of a sudden, the third generation, they have kicked in. And it's just thrilling to see that they're really picking up the torch, where some of their parents, and I'm not maligning them, not all of them, but they are doing a great job in trying to make sure we don't forget, as the rabbi said, because some of it is just really terrible. When I read the statistics this week about the percentage of people who don't know about the Holocaust and never heard of Auschwitz, let's say, although Auschwitz is the camp that most people do know about, and I bristle a little bit since I'm on a Holocaust Remembrance and Education Commission, because Auschwitz is what everybody talks about. I call Auschwitz the firmament in the stars of Holocaust centers and concentration camps, because there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of concentration camps, and there are many survivors in this community, which incidentally are getting less and less. And if you can believe it, I'm on the young end of survivors. So I think that the recognition has to be given to all those hundreds of camps. I actually went back for the first time to Germany on a trip with the Associated Jewish Federation of Baltimore, and we went to Berlin, and then we went to Vienna. And I was a wreck, to put it mildly, and this 64-year marriage almost came to an end because my husband said, "Why are you going back there?" He's American. "Why are you going back there?" One week I was going, one week I wasn't going. I finally decided I was going to go, and I was very apprehensive about Berlin, only to find that when I got to Berlin, you couldn't turn a corner without some recognition of the Holocaust. And I left there feeling a whole lot better until I got to Vienna, because the Austrians still think that they were victims and not perpetrators, so that was put a whole different spin on that. But in the meantime, I spend a lot of time doing social action these days, and I've started bringing into this talk, which I never did until about a year ago, the plight of the people who are undocumented immigrants. I'm actually co-chairing an immigrant commission in my congregation. My congregation is social actions, like something they've always done. It's part of our DNA. So I see myself very much not only as a survivor, but really as an immigrant. And the immigrant story has become very, very important to me, and I'm trying to help these people. So it's the very least I can do. So that's kind of my story. There's always more, and I always welcome Q&A, and I don't know if you'll have time because that always brings up all the things I forgot to tell you. But I do want to close with a quote that I found from an author. Her name was Rachel Salamander, and she said, "The past lives only in us. It's memory that gives it historical reality, making images and words from the past into an aspect of present-day consciousness." And I hope that's what I can continue to do for a long time. Thank you very much. And do we have time for any Q&A? Thank you. No Q&A? Okay. Pardon me? Oh, okay.
Let me just bless the Martha Weiman that she should have many, many more long years of gesund, of good health, together with her husband and children and grandchildren. I must say that my wife is second generation. We're in our early 70s. My wife is young. I'm older. But my wife's parents were the only survivors in their families. Her mother and father were the only survivors in their families. She never grew up with grandparents or uncles or aunts or cousins. And whenever she asked her father about what happened, he would say, "What do you have to know for?" He would never discuss with her ever what happened, and they're gone. So it's so true. We need people to stand up and to recall. In Hebrew and in English, those who can stand, please stand. El Moleh Bachamim, Shochein Barmomim, Hamsei Menucha Nechona, Al Kanfchei Hashchina, B'Malot Kedoshim U'Tovim Kizor Rakiya, Masirim Nishmos HaKadoshim Batorim, Shehumsu V'Shenergu V'Shnishtratu V'Nisrifu, V'nishbe'u v'shenachnaku al kiddush Hashem. Ayidei hatzorim ha'germonim yimach shemam zichrum. Began Eden temenochosom lochein balarachamim. Yasti bein b'tzeisek naflov liolamim. B'tzor chayim es nushmosehem. Adonai hu nachlasom yinuchu b'shalomam shkavosehem. B'namar Amen. O God, full of mercy, who dwells on high, grant proper rest on the wings of the divine presence, and the lofty levels of the holy and the pure, who shine like the glow of the firmament for the souls of the holy and pure ones who were killed, murdered, slaughtered, burned, drowned, and strangled, all for the sanctification of thy name, through the hands of the German oppressors and the Polish. May their name and memory be obliterated. Therefore, we ask that their resting place be in the Garden of Eden. May the Master of Mercy shelter them in the shelter of his wings for eternity. May he bind their souls in the bond of life. The Almighty, you are their heritage, and may they repose in peace in their resting places. Let us respond, Amen.
I would like to thank from the Office of Communications, Division of Design Services, Judy Coble, for designing the program and poster for this event. I would also like to thank the members of the CMS Holocaust Memorial Program Committee and the Office of Equal Opportunity and Civil Rights for making this program possible. This concludes our program, and thank you for attending and listening.